Spiritual Reality by Giovanni Gentile. To understand, much more to know, spiritual reality is to assimilate it with ourselves who know it. We may even say that a law of the knowledge of spiritual reality is that the object be resolved into the subject. Nothing has for us spiritual value save in so far as it comes to be resolved into ourselves who know it. We usually distinguish the spiritual objects of our knowledge into two classes. Either they are subjects of experience, men, intelligent beings, or they are not themselves subjects of experience, but the spiritual fact or mental work which such subjects presuppose. This is an empirical distinction which vanishes the moment we reflect on it, not, indeed, if we only bring to bear on it the reflection proper to empiricism, but if we reflect on the reflection proper to philosophy, that which begins with skeptical doubt of the firm beliefs of common sense. The moment we examine the nature of the spiritual facts which we distinguish from true and proper subjects of experience, we see that the distinction is inadmissible. Thus, there is no science which is not particular, in the sense that it is what particular, historically determined individuals possessed in thinking it, yet we distinguish the science of men from science in itself. So too with language. Although it is an historical product, we begin by detaching it from every particular person who uses it, who is himself unique, and for whom the language he uses is, moment by moment, a unique language. We extend it to a whole people, and, mentally, we even detach it from all and every people, and no longer speak of a definite language, but of language in general. The means, as we say, of expressing states of mind, a form of thought. Language, so conceived and fixed by our mind, is then freed from all contingency, or particular limitation, and hovers in the world of concepts, which is not only the world of the actual, but also the world of the simply possible. Language has now become an ideal fact. And lo, on the one hand, there is the language sounding from a man's lips, the speech of one particular man, a language whose reality consists in the personality of the speaker, and, on the other hand, language in itself, which can be spoken, but which is what it is even though no one should speak it. But the truth is that if we would know language in the concrete, it must present itself to us as development. Then, it is the language which sounds forth from the mouths of the men who use it. We no longer detach it from the subject, and it is not a spiritual fact which we can distinguish from the mind in which it exists. The spiritual act, which we call language, is precisely the mind itself in its concreteness. So, when we speak of a language, and believe that we mean not an historical language, but a language conceived as a psychical or ideal fact apart from history, a fact as it were inherent in the very nature of mind, and ideally reconstructed whenever its principle is meant, and when we believe that in this case we have completely detached it from the particular individual who, from time to time, speaks a particular language, what we are then really doing is forming a concept of language by reconstructing a moment of our own consciousness, a moment of our own spiritual experience. Detach from language the philosopher who reconstructs it, and language as a moment of mind disappears. Since language, hovering loose, transcendent, and freed from time and space, is language as it is conceived by the man, the individual, who can only effectively represent it by speaking it, and who speaks it just to the extent that he represents it. Yet do we not distinguish the Divine Comedy from Dante, its author, and from ourselves, its readers? We do, but then even in making the distinction we know that this Divine Comedy is with us, and in us, within our mind, thought of as distinct from us. It is in us despite the distinction, in us insofar as we think it, so that it, the poem, is precisely we who think it. To detach, then, the facts of the mind from the real life of the mind is to miss their true inward nature by looking at them as they are when realized. When we speak of spiritual fact, we speak of mind, and to speak of mind is always to speak of concrete, historical individuality, of a subject which is not thought as such, but which is actualized as such. The spiritual reality, then, which is the object of our knowing, is not mind and spiritual fact. It is purely and simply mind as subject. As subject, it can, as we have said, be known on one condition only. It can be known only insofar as its objectivity is resolved in the real activity of the subject who knows it. In no other way is a spiritual world conceivable. Whoever conceives it, if he has truly conceived it as spiritual, cannot set it up in opposition to his own activity in conceiving it. Speaking strictly, there can be no others outside us, for, in knowing them and speaking of them, they are within us. To know is to identify, to overcome otherness as such. Other is a kind of stage of our mind through which we must pass in obedience to our immanent nature. But we must pass through without stopping. When we find ourselves confronted with the spiritual existence of others, as with something different from ourselves, something from which we must distinguish ourselves, something which we presuppose as having been in existence before our birth, and which even when we are no longer there to think, will always remain the possession, or at least the possible possession, of other men, it is a clear sign that we are not yet truly in their presence as spiritual existence, or, rather, that we do not see the spirituality of their existence. The doctrine that the spiritual world is only conceivable as the reality of my own spiritual activity would be clearly absurd were we to seek to interpret it in any other light than that of the distinction explained in the last chapter between the transcendental ego and the empirical ego. It is only rational when we clearly and firmly apprehend the concept of the reality of the transcendental ego as the fundamental reality, without which the reality of the empirical ego is not thinkable. Applied to the empirical ego, the doctrine is meaningless. Empirically, I am an individual, and, as such, in opposition not only to all material things, but equally to all the individuals to whom I assign a spiritual value, since all objects of experience, whatever their value, are not only distinct but separate from one another, in such a manner that each of them absolutely excludes from itself, by its own particularity, all the others. In the empirical domain, moral problems arise entirely and precisely in this absolute opposition, in which the ego empirically conceived stands distinct from other persons. The supreme moral aspiration of our being as empirical individuals is to acquire a harmony, a unity with all the others, and with all that is other. This means that moral problems arise insofar as we become aware of the unreality of our being as an empirical ego, opposed to the other persons and surrounding things, and come to see that our own life is actualized in the things opposed to it. Though, on such ground, the moral problems arise, they are only solved when man comes to feel another's needs his own. and thereby finds that his own life means that he is not closed within the narrow circle of his empirical personality, but ever expanding in the efficacity of a mind above all particular interests, and yet immanent in the very center of his deeper personality. Let it not be thought that the concept of this deeper personality, the person which has no plurality, in any way excludes and effectually annuls the concept of the empirical ego. Idealism does not mean mysticism. The particular individual is not lost in the being of the I, which is absolute and truly real. For this absolute I unifies, but does not destroy. It is the one which unifies in itself every particular and empirical ego. The reality of the transcendental ego even implies the reality of the empirical ego. It is only when it is cut off from its immanent relation with the transcendental ego that the empirical ego is falsely conceived. If we would understand the nature of this subject, the unique and unifying transcendental I, in which the whole objectivity of spiritual beings is resolved, confronted by nothing which can assert independence, a subject, therefore, with no otherness opposed to it, if we would understand the nature of this reality, we must think of it not as a being or a state, but as a constructive process. Giambattista Vico, in his De Antiquissima Italorum Sapientia, 1710, chose as his motto, Verum e factum convertuntur. It showed profound insight. Reader's note. Verum e factum convertuntur translate to, the true and the made are interchangeable. End reader's note. The concept of truth coincides with the concept of fact. The true is what is in the making. Nature is the true, according to Vico, only for the divine intellect, which is creative of nature, and nature cannot be the true for man, for nature is not made by us, and into its secrets it is not given to us, therefore to penetrate. All we can see of these secrets is the phenomena in their extrinsic de facto modes of linkage, as Hume would say a little later. But we cannot know why one phenomenon must follow on another, nor in general why what is. When we look within nature itself, all is turbid, mysterious. On the other hand, in regard to everything which we understand because it is our own doing, the criterion of truth is clearly within us. For example, what is a straight line? We know because we ourselves construct it in the inmost recess of our own thinking by means of our own imagination. The straight line is not in nature. We understand it thanks to our imagination, and not immediately, but by constructing it. So later, in his Scienza Nuova, 1725, Vico tells us that the human mind can know the laws of the eternal historical process, conceived as spiritual development, because the cause and first origin of all historical events is in the human mind. The greatest effort we can make, still following Vico, to get within the process of nature is experiment. And in experiment, it is we ourselves who dispose the causes for producing the effects. But even in the case of experiment, the efficient principle remains within nature itself, whose forces we use without any means of knowing the internal mode of their working. And even in experiment, our knowledge stops at the simple discovery of the de facto connections, so that the inward activity of the real, which ought to be the true and proper object of knowledge, escapes us. Our experiments, being operations extrinsic to nature, can only yield a superficial knowledge of it. Its superficiality or its defect, as truth, is most clearly seen when natural science is compared with mathematics, and even more so when it is compared with the science of the human world, with what Vico called the world of the nations. For numbers and magnitudes, the realities studied by mathematics are constructed by us. They are not realities in their own right, but fictions, suppositions, merely postulated entities, whereas history is true and effectual reality. When we have understood history by mentally reconstructing its reality, there remains nothing outside it, no reality independent of history, by which we can possibly test our reconstruction and decide whether it corresponds or not. What, then, is the meaning of this doctrine of Vico? It teaches us that we can only say we know an object when there is in that object nothing immediate, nothing which our thought finds there already before we begin to know it. Real, therefore, even before it is known. Immediate knowledge is a contradictio in adjecto. Would you know what language is? There is no better answer than the remark of von Humboldt, 1767 to 1835. True language is not opus, but opera. It is not the result of the linguistic process, but is precisely that process which is developed in act. Whatever language is, then, we know it, not in its definite being, which it never has, but step by step in its concrete development. And, as with language, so with all spiritual reality. You can only know it, so to say, by resolving it into your own spiritual activity, gradually establishing that self-sameness or unity in which knowledge consists. Destroy the degrees or steps of the development, and there is no longer the development. You have destroyed the very reality whose realization and understanding is in question. The truth is that the fact, which is convertible with the truth, in being the same spiritual reality which realizes itself, or which is known in its realizing, is not, strictly speaking, a fact or a deed, but a doing. We ought then rather to say, the truth and the act are interchangeable.